think I'd like to ask Kelsey to give us uh, a little blurb about our executive director about WARP, Weave a Real Peace. And Kelsey, take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Judy. And welcome to everyone who's here joining us today. I want to thank you for taking time on your Saturday to be with us. And I want to thank our three fantastic presenters who are going to be speaking today. Today's program is Continuing Textile Traditions of the Arab World. And this is part of our monthly panel discussion series. I'm going to screen share and just briefly show you the WARP website. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are Weave a Real Peace, or WARP, and we are an international textile networking organization. So you can find more about WARP at weavearealpeace.org. And I just want to share a couple of things briefly. Under this first events tab, you can find all of our upcoming programs. We have monthly programs like this one that are free and open to all. And then we also have a number of members only events. So you can find all of those there. And you can also find recordings of all of our previous panel discussions and programs here under previous events. So please feel free to take a look at all of our former panel discussions. And then lastly, I just want to share that we have here down, if you scroll down a bit on the homepage, we have a special program this month, Continuing Textile Traditions, a fundraiser for Ukraine. And this is in addition to our normal monthly programming. We have organized this panel discussion with four Ukrainian weavers who will be sharing their work with us and also sharing a bit about how they are being impacted by the war. And all donations, this is an optional donation to attend, but all donations will be sent to a nonprofit called Rhizome, which is providing relief for on-the-ground efforts in Ukraine. It's all volunteer-based, and every bit of funding that they receive goes directly to aid for Ukraine. So we invite you to visit the homepage and click there to register. So now I'll stop screen sharing. And again, thank you all for being here today, and I will turn it over to Judy to introduce our panelists.
So we're going to take a trip visually as well as auditorily, I guess, to the Arab world this afternoon with three interesting presenters, all of whom have devoted themselves to the cultural heritage and textiles of the Arab world. The first presenter is Wafa Ghnaim, who's a Palestinian-American artist living in Washington, D.C. She's the first ever Palestinian embroidery instructor at the Smithsonian Museum and collection specialist at the Museum of the Palestinian People. She founded Tatreez Tea and also wrote a book by the same name to document the stories and patterns of Palestinian embroidery designs. Wafa, I think you're up.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen. And welcome to my world. As you'll see, Dr. Vogelsang-Eastwood and Dr. Reem are going to be traveling through many different parts of textile study and textile research for this part of the world. And in my particular part of the world, I'm residing here in the United States. From Washington, D.C., one thing that I want to really focus on is Palestinian embroidery and textile preservation, as well as from a cultural, perspective, and what that means in the diaspora. And this isn't just Palestinian diaspora as a whole. This is really particular to preserving Palestinian artistry and history within the Western world, and particularly in a country that stigmatizes Palestinian identity. Many of you know me just through my book, Tatreez Tea, that I published in 2018, or on Instagram. I have a following on Instagram. My book and that I originally wrote brought me to this practice and to this field in kind of a full-time way. But when I wrote the book, I actually had a full-time job. I have an MBA. I was in the private sector. I had at that time gotten pregnant. Like, I had not anticipated what was coming next for me after publishing Tatreez Tea. And Tatreez Tea was primarily a book. Actually, it's different. It's not intending on preserving the motifs and the patterns from before 1948 in Palestine. No, that was not my goal with the book. The goal with Tatreez Tea was to focus in on how Palestinian textiles and Palestinian embroidery traditions are passed on in the diaspora. My mother, Feryal Abbasi-Ghnaim, which I'll talk about in a moment, you know, she has been teaching Palestinian embroidery. She taught at first in the refugee camps in Syria and Jordan, and then in the United States for the last 4 decades. And so I learned with my sisters under her, and in the process of kind of organizing my book, researching my book, documenting the lessons that my mother taught me and my sisters, as well as trying to raise awareness. I mean, my mother is really an arts activist in the 1980s and 90s in Boston, which in Oregon, many of you know, it's in the United States very stigmatized to even identify as Palestinian, let alone to be an activist in the arts community in Palestinian tradition. So me and my sisters kind of grew up in this environment, but my book really was not intended on being this academic contribution. It meant to be an oral history documentation purely. So at that time that I wrote this book, I had hoped that it would inspire other families in the diaspora to also preserve Palestinian culture within their families, exiled families, and that maybe my mother's methods and lessons could help them preserve this for multiple generations that grew up outside of Palestine. So I grew up in Palestinian embroidery. As I told you, my mother for decades has taught Palestinian embroidery in her local community. And I was born in the United States and grew up in the United States. So I had a strong drive to connect to my cultural heritage in a country that made it very difficult for me to understand kind of why that I felt always very wrong for saying like I was in trouble anytime I said I was Palestinian. And as a child, I didn't quite understand what that meant. I wore thobes to school. I mean, my mother would get us dressed in a thobe for picture day. I mean, it was a fancy occasion picture day. So we would wear our thobe and our coin-lined bonnets, and we would go get our pictures taken. But we were heavily bullied, and we endured a lot. Like there was quite a lot of bullying and threatening behavior towards us growing up, and I never really quite understood it. And once I started to understand, I started to develop this confidence in myself and this stronger desire to share what I know and to stand in my identity and to connect with my cultural identity. But then I started developing a research interest, which you see here on the right-hand side of the screen. I started to develop kind of a research interest in documenting Palestinian embroidery and our traditions from the United States and how our dresses ended up in the United States in these museums in the first place. Many of the museums here, you don't have access to the Palestinian or Syrian textile collections. They're usually an archive, and you have to have like connections basically to get in to see those. And many of those pieces do not even have identifying information or proper geographic attribution. And so much of my work over the last couple of years has developed within a museum context as, if you will, kind of an arts activist within that space, which is very difficult to establish yourself as. The reason I kind of love this image of me at the Museum of the Palestinian People, while you can see the art on the floor, they're putting together an exhibit while I'm studying this dress, is that the Museum of the Palestinian People is really the only museum in the United States that I have access to touching the textiles and actually studying them. At other museums that I study at, usually my hair is in a hairnet, have gloves on and I can't even touch what's being presented to me. And so much of like studying this and understanding like what materials are involved in the dresses, like I need to be able to touch them. I can't just look at them. So I ended up developing an interest in magnifier and microscopes, because to kind of work around the limitations of the United States museums not allowing me to touch the dresses, I use the magnifier as a way to help me in my study because of that. A little bit more just about my family and like kind of what brought me to this work is my mother was born in Safad, and in 1948 her and the family and her as a very young girl were exiled to Syria. So my mother grew up in Syria, and that's why my work has generally focused on Palestine, but I'm moving into Syria more, and I have a lot of Syrian garments because I'm kind of now trying to understand Syria and the beautiful textile traditions there. And my mother, as I was telling you, in the 1980s, when she immigrated into the United States and had me and my sisters, you know, she spent, you know, her day-to-day kind of work and dedicated her life really to raising awareness about Palestinian embroidery, Palestinian textiles. And so my work is heavily influenced by my mother. This is us at a demonstration at Boston Children's Museum, actually in 1985. I was 2 years old at this time. I'm right there in pigtails. And we would sit and we would just work on embroidery, and people would come ask us questions. And this was the way I grew up. I don't have a first memory of Palestinian embroidery. It's been my life. I don't know life without it. It's the way that I connect to my cultural heritage. And this is the gift, I think, that my mother gave me and my sisters, is this whenever we are in a place, especially, again, I can't emphasize enough for people who don't live in the United States, when you live in a country where your own identity and culture is stigmatized and turned into kind of a political taboo, you have to work extra hard to centering yourself and your identity and in your culture. And I loved working next to my mother. I loved helping her in these demonstrations and these festivals, but I had a really hard time kind of listening into some of the questions that she would receive. And we would have people come and touch our hair without asking us, and touch the embroidery without asking us, and eat their ice cream cones while leaning over our embroidery. And these kinds of treatments and questions to us always made me feel sort of othered and different. And it gave me a foundation to build my work. And by the 1990s, you know, growing up in that kind of environment, by the 1990s, my mother decided to teach us how to make our first thobe, our first dress. And this was a heavily influential time for me, because we worked together on what I call the Gardens dress. It's the main dress in my book, Tatreez Tea. And we received an apprenticeship to do it. And so me and my sisters and my mom worked on this thobe for a few years until we finished it. And so sort of kind of working around these different arts organizations around the United States, figuring out funding, figuring out how to operate as Palestinian, and sort of like preserving my culture and preserving this art form in this space, in this culture, in this society that America is, was very instructive to me and the development of Tatreez Tea. And ultimately, it was kind of the baton that was passed to me, as my mother taught in the 1970s at Damascus University and all around Syria and in the refugee camps. Now today, I've sort of carried on the baton, taken the baton, if you will, and developed Tatreez Tea. And originally, it was this kind of initiative just to teach some classes about how to do, you know, this art form, and it grew into this practice where I'm really centering history and the history of the Palestinian people and the history of this art form as a way to understand the art form, and as being inextricably linked to the practice of the art form. So I've developed like a number of projects and courses to educate people about the different regional styles that exist in historic Palestine, and ways that we can kind of connect to our cultural identity within a contemporary framework. And, you know, and just like kind of finishing up and just kind of sharing my work and kind of what I've been doing. Many of you might have seen some of my videos shared. I don't know if any of you have gone viral before online, but I have, and it's a very terrifying experience. You know, it's terrifying because you have hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of people coming at you, and some of it's positive, but there's a lot of negative, and it's a lot of criticism. It's very overwhelming. The internet isn't, it's not, a lot of people sort of like aim to go viral, but they don't understand quite how terrifying it is to go viral because of that backlash. And so I've had, you know, a lot of criticisms online for my work from various groups of people. And I guess my main sort of goal is to find a way for the Palestinian community to kind of come together in a unifying fashion so that we can work together against our own oppression, and we can elevate and support the Palestinian voices that are speaking up and are putting themselves on the front lines to you know, I guess, humanize who we are. And so much of my work is to elevate Palestinian voices and to ensure Palestinians carry on traditions for the next generation. But at the same time, my work is also to activate non-Palestinians who want to thread their needle and stitch our traditional motifs, but don't know how to support the freedom of the Palestinian people. And so translating one to the other is sort of my life's goal and the work that I do with Tatreez Tea. And thank you so much for having me. And I hope I've given you a great foundation for what I have to offer. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Wafa. That was stunning work. And I have all kinds of questions about how certain things are done, but I'm going to hold them, just like I'll ask the rest of you too. Unless you have a specific question about something she said that was puzzling, we'll take questions at the end, but we'll go ahead and have all three presenters speak, and then we'll do discussion and questions afterwards. I will monitor the chat though, and if there's something confusing or needs clarification, I'll interrupt and ask that question. The other thing I want to mention, if you haven't already done it, we go into these panels muted so that we don't unintentionally interrupt the presentation. I noticed there were a few little interruptions in the last talk, and I'm not sure why that happened. Maybe it was my internet network, but if you aren't speaking, then you should mute yourself, please, and then we'll all unmute toward the end. All right, very good. I want to introduce our second speaker to you now, and this is Dr. Gillian Vogelsang, and she's director of the Textile Research Centre in Leiden in the Netherlands. She's a specialist in Middle Eastern embroidery, textile, and dress, and has worked for many years as a textile archaeologist in Egypt, and is the author of a number of books about textiles, including the Encyclopedia of Embroidery from the Arab World, which I know would be fascinating to have in your home. So this is, I don't know about the rest of you, but for me, this is an introduction to a part of the world in textiles that I'm not that familiar with. So I'm particularly enjoying the similarities to some that I know, and then the differences. And it's certainly an enriching opportunity to be here with Warp on a Saturday afternoon. So Gillian, would you please do us the honors?
Yes, with greatest of pleasure. Wafa, lovely presentation, and so many items that you spoke about. I thought, yes, I can relate to this. I understand this. I cannot remember when I didn't have a textile in my hand. And embroidery has spoken to me since I was a small child. I can just look at it, feel it, and feel it. Feel it, feel it, feel it. It is so important to be able to feel textiles. Textile people, you just have to do that, and people understand what you mean. You gain so much information through your fingers. And that is one of the reasons why the TRC, the Textile Research Centre in Leiden, we decided we were going to have a handling collection and not a preservation collection, because textile people need to understand. And the collection started in 1997 because I was not allowed to use part of the collection at the National Museum of Ethnology, where I was curator for textiles and dress, for teaching textiles to students. So my husband and I, and he worked in Afghanistan as an archaeologist in Syria. I worked as an archaeologist, a textile archaeologist in Egypt. So we looked through our home to see what is there that is non-European, Arab world that we could use for teaching. And we came up with 40 pieces. And that was the basic element of the collection. And it's always been a handling collection ever since. What I hadn't anticipated when I started all this work was how big the collection would grow. I understood about the diversity of textile technology. I had studied it. I'm a design historian, I'm a textile archaeologist. But the world of textiles is vast. And I keep being told I have to specialize. And I keep telling people I specialize in textiles. It's not my fault that it's a huge subject. And it's the diversity of the subject that we need to tell the world about. It's not a small subject. It's vast. It's been important to human beings from the first moment they put a feather in their hair or a bead around their neck. Dress and identity, textiles, adornment, essential to human life. Not just cultural heritage, it's much, much bigger. It's about people. So over the years, we have built up this handling collection, teaching collection, and also the teaching aspects of what we do at Leiden. And it is now online, over 38,000 textiles, garments, and accessories, and it's open access. Everybody can use it. And we encourage people to let us know, have we got something wrong? Have we got something right? Can we put more information in there? And let's get it out there to the textile community that this is an important facility for everybody to use. And because of my special interest and work in the Middle East, I first went to Egypt in 1982 as an archaeologist, working on Amarna, the site of Tutankhamun and Akhenaten. And then later I was on other excavations such as Wafa Ghnaim, which is on the Red Sea coast of Egypt and had Roman period and Islamic period. So my knowledge of Egyptian Middle Eastern textiles goes from prehistoric through to, well, it was up to the medieval period, it's now modern. Because the story continues, it never stops, and it should never be forced to stop. And as people develop, ideas develop, patterns develop, materials develop, so dress and identity, textiles need to develop. And sometimes we agree with what's happening and sometimes we don't. Irrelevant. It needs to develop and not be put on a pinnacle and said, this is it. No, you can always do more with it. Not everybody agrees with me on that one, but minor detail. So what we've done, say, with the Middle Eastern collection is strengthen. We've got a good Saudi Arabian, we have good Yemen, we have good Egyptian, and talking with people. And we've been trying to support various embroidery groups, say in Yemen. Unfortunately, the civil war has meant that we've been cut off from that. But we also give a lot of teaching at the TRC and encourage the idea that everybody should be able to learn these techniques. It doesn't just belong to one group, it belongs to everybody. We're all human beings, and let's celebrate that fact. Let's celebrate the diversity as well as the similarities. One of the scary things that happened to us a few years ago was the then ambassador of Yemen came and said, could the TRC be the cultural arc for Yemeni textiles and dress? They knew civil war was coming. So they went to various institutions and asked, can you help us? Can you preserve this element of our culture for future generations? We're not paid for it. We're doing it because we think it's important. And we agreed. And that's why we're building up these different aspects, but putting them online. And that's the essential thing. getting the information out there, trying to get it as correct as possible, and making the world aware of how much you can learn about other cultures by looking at textiles. It's non-threatening in the first place, or it shouldn't be. Politically, clothing, well, as Wafa has said, deep, deep emotions can arise. But it can also mean I can talk to Wafa, I can talk to Reem, I can talk to everybody. I say, that's an interesting textile. Tell me about it. How do you do it? Why do you do it this way? And once you're in communications with people, they're no longer as scary. Talk with people, talk about textiles, and the world will be a much, much better place. But the main problem is there are not enough textile collections on display, not enough access to textile collections. That's why the work of Reem and Wafa is so important. People have to be able to see and to look at, and yes, touch. If we're going to save the world, we've got to save it through textiles, which sounds a very big thing at the moment, and certainly with Ukraine. But what WARP is doing is getting the Ukrainian people to talk about their textiles. Wonderful. But we also have to help preserve knowledge, study facilities, and just pass on our enthusiasm, our love for these objects to the next generation and the generation after that. Because there is so much in a textile. It's not just a dirty little rag. It's a whole history of a person and a culture and the world. So get out there and talk about textiles. And don't be put off by the bullies who say, yeah, it's not important. It's just a woman's subject. It is a minor interest. No, it's not. Just tell them to take their clothing off if they think it's a minor interest. I've done it for 25 years, and so far, nobody in public, in one of my lectures, has ever taken their clothing off. And from that moment onwards, people understand how important textiles, clothing, accessories are, because they are scared of going without their clothing. It's so simple. And even if they did take it off, it's a win, because it means other people go, ah, or embarrassed or laughter. So it's a win-win. So ask the politicians, ask the cultural managers, ask the museum world to take their clothing off if they think textiles are not important. So Reem and Wafa, I salute you. I really do. You're doing wonderful work in making people aware that Middle Eastern Arab culture is such a rich, vibrant, historical tradition that needs to be supported and passed on. Because without it, the world is a much poorer place. And I think I better stop there, or else I will talk for the next 5 hours. Judy?
Judy, I'm just briefly sharing this slide with the contact information for the Textile Research Centre for anyone who wants to take this down.
Yes, I actually went to that once. You popped it into the chat, and it's beautiful images on your site. So please, everyone, take a visit, take a look. Do you happen to know how many different textiles are on your site right now, Gillian?
The last time I looked, it was 38,362.
Yeah.
But we've just been given a donation of, well, 2 donations of about 1,600 textiles and garments, and we're working our way through that. So I think by the beginning of summer, it will be 40,000.
Very good.
And it's all done by volunteers. We're trying to change this situation because of the perception of a group of women volunteers are not professional. I disagree with this totally and utterly, but it's a perception. We just have to work very hard at changing people's attitudes towards textiles.
Yes, understood. I've never tried that trick of suggesting people take their clothes off at a lecture, but you've given me something to think about.
You may
All
have to be
right.
careful which lecture you do it at.
Yeah, I'll say. All right, our third speaker today is Dr. Reem El-Matwali, who's an author, curator, and founder of the Zay Initiative. And that's a nonprofit UK registered initiative advancing the preservation of cultural heritage through collecting, documenting, and archiving Arab historical attire and their stories. With over 30 years of experience, Dr. Reem is an expert consultant in Islamic art and architecture, interior design, historic dress, and the United Arab Emirates heritage. Dr. Reem.
Hello, I prepared a small presentation and I would love to share my screen in order for us to go through it, if I may. And I'm happy that I will conclude this talk because maybe it will help situate you into what we're talking about in the Arab world. As we just found out, fashion is often a reflection of the cultural conversation of its time. And today we have more options than ever for us all to express ourselves. I thank you for inviting me to showcase our short journey, for the Zay Initiative is hardly 4 years old and growing, and we are still looking to be housed and funded. To introduce you to the Arab world, I would like to first begin by presenting a small background about myself. I was born in Iraq, but never lived there. I grew up in the UAE, and for those who are not familiar with the term, it is where Dubai is found. I went to a boarding school in Surrey, England at the age of 10, and having been accepted at the Royal College of Surgeons to do medicine, I opted to go to Kansas, Midwest America for my bachelor's degree. I went back to the UK and did my master's and PhD at SOAS. I'm a naturalized Canadian with an American-born, Kansas-born daughter. I live between Canada, UAE, and the UK. So I have literally spent my whole life trying to decode one culture to the other. Now, let me begin today by explaining what does the word Zay mean. The name originates from the Arabic term Zay, and Zay means the costume and general attire of certain country or era. Simply put, the Zay Initiative collects the tangible to narrate the intangible. We collect artifacts to help record the stories of those who used or wore them. And we are more than a platform that aims to attract individuals who are intellectually curious about the Arab world in order to spread knowledge and deepen or broaden their understanding of the region. At present, what today is referred to as Swana, or in general, and the Arab world in particular, it is associated either with uprisings, conflict wars, destruction, or with the production of oil and petrochemicals. But for centuries, the region has been supplying Europe with silk, cotton, and flax. The textile industry was the largest during the medieval and early modern era, and this trade has left its trademark in many ways, especially in the languages of Europe. And let me give you a few examples. Cotton comes from qutn, which is an Arabic word. Damas comes from Dimashq, which is a city in Syria. Gauze from the Arabic qaz, which means rose silk. Muslin from Mosul, which is a city in Iraq. Chiffon is from shaf, which means transparent in Arabic. While chemise is from the Arabic qamis. Kaftan is from the Arabic Khaftan, which is originally khaftan in Persian. Jumper from jubba, meaning coat, and so on and so forth. To further clarify, what do we mean when we say the Arab world? The Arab world is full of rich and diverse communities, ethnicities, religions, and groups and cultures, including Muslims, Christians, Jews, Yazidis, Kurds, and many other minorities. Differences do exist among countries, but within countries as well. And there are over 200 million Arabs worldwide. Generally, anyone who adopts the Arabic language is typically called an Arab. Now, our mission at the Zay Initiative is to collect, document, and conserve Arab culture through dress and adornment. to present this collection and contextualize it through a digital archive and a blog, to encourage intellectual dialogue in order to highlight our shared humanity, and to inspire and educate designers to aid in creating for a sustainable future, to empower women regionally and globally by bringing their untold stories to life. So many misconceptions arise when we speak or when Arab or Muslim women are mentioned. First and foremost, the two terms Muslim and Arab are often understood to be interchangeable, but they are not. Not all Arabs are Muslims, nor all Muslims are Arabs. I just outlined what an Arab is. While Islam is a faith, and in most estimates, about 1/5 of humanity's 6 billion plus people, approximately 1.6 billion are Muslims. In other words, a Muslim is a person or an individual that embraces the religion of Islam. They range from Indonesia, Southeast Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Africa, China, Australia, Western Europe to Canada and the United States. Meanwhile, Arab women today are a generation that grew among globalization. And thanks to technology, they have been exposed to the world around them. Many have grown up educated, exposed to consumer culture, and expect to express every aspect of themselves through participation and contribution. They are women looking for clothes that are stylish and fashionable, but also in line with their religious and cultural beliefs. They have larger amounts of disposable income thanks to their new positions in the workplace rather than just at home. And thus they are a force to reckon with. Even in today's world, the hijab is often reduced to a vilified symbol and pawn in the culture of fear. Women in hijab risk stereotyping, social exclusion, judgment, and abuse. Many associate the veil with extremism and female suppression. This is not always the case, nor does it represent the complete story. For many women who wear the hijab, it is a matter of choice, preserving their modesty, privacy, and respect of their culture, religion, and traditions. I chose here to show you a short clip, A, to showcase a unique article in the Zay collection, and B, to illustrate the many possible functions of the veil or the face mask that might have been alien to Western culture, but with today's circumstances and the experiences that we've all shared, I'm sure we are all aware to the hygienic and protective nature of this article of clothing.
The Zay Initiative presents this fabulous Burqa Riyasi Bunyum. This presidential face mask was specially created in 1999 by Sheikh Hamda bint Mohammed al-Nahyan and gifted to the founder of the Zay Initiative, Dr. Reem Tariq al-Matwalli. The overall shape of the face mask follows the Yasi style. In direct reference to Yas tribe, the fabric is dyed using indigo, found in grades of bluish to purple, which is then rubbed and burnished to produce a metallic luster. The indigo would dye the skin of the wearer blue. For this reason, since the 1980s, masking tape and laterally prefabricated adhesive plastic sheets are placed on the back to protect the skin. The face mask's 18-karat gold embellishments are hand-sewn. The top line is composed of 23 round discs that resemble stars and are thus known as Niu or Nujum. They are followed by another line of larger discs known as Huruf. The burqa is fastened to the head using a braided golden metallic cord known as shubuj. This represents a physical example of the traditional Arabic saying zina wa khazina, meaning beauty and wealth in one.
So how does the Zay collection help highlight the exchange of historical influences, be it along the Silk Road or at present day human global dispersal, as Wafa just mentioned? This is an example. Amat al-Zahawi is an example to illustrate this continuous movement of people and cultures. Dr. al-Zahawi was born in 1920 and was one of the first handful of Iraqi women, actually the first class of women doctors to graduate from the Royal College of Medicine in Baghdad in 1943. In 1950, Dr. Zahawi passed the California State Board test, making her the first Iraqi woman to obtain a license to practice medicine in that state. Dr. Zahawi requested this overgown known as Hashmi from her family in Iraq, who brought it from Basra and shipped it to America. In 1960, a New York-based artist, John Kosh, created an oil portrait recording the esteemed doctor dressed in an Hashmi. Today, this article of dress and the story of this formidable woman, among many other such examples, are preserved eternally through the Zay Initiative collection and available to the public globally through the Zay Initiative Digital Archive. We shed further light on such narratives through the real-life exhibitions and installations regionally and internationally. And Dr. Gillian just spoke about Yemen. We also work with those in conflict zones, such as Yemen, where we have compiled quite a comprehensive collection of over 130 components of dress that we rescued during this past period. And we are in the process of studying and documenting it to preserve it for future generations. Additionally, as preservers of Arab dress heritage, we acknowledge the cross-cultural influences that occurred throughout history and continue to do so to date. The Arab world does not exist in a vacuum. I said earlier, it is cross-pollinated by the influences of the multitude of ethnicities and religions woven within its culture. It also constantly shares traditions with neighboring as well as trading countries and throughout time. Thus, one cannot speak of the Arab dress without drawing parallels or contrasts. As part of our community outreach, we created this unique, free, and interactive global digital access to dress culture of the Arab world that is growing by the day as we populate it by publishing the collection one article at a time. You can reach this digital archive, as you can see, through a menu in our website and choose the language, be it Arabic or English, by which to navigate. Once you are on the page, the information is connected to the dictionary through pop-up bubbles or links to relate blogs, webinars, videos, such as the one I just shared with you, that deep dive into multiple levels of information. Now, you might ask, what about men? Do they not have a share in all of this? Yes, we do connect men's attire, and when possible, we write about these and how they wore them and how they used them. Now, other than searching for the articles themselves, if one needs to deep dive into more information, one can explore our blog to read in-depth articles on each type of clothing and to get to know the stories of the people who wrote them, or meet experts who have spent their lives working on the topic, collecting precious artifacts, writing and documenting them. Actually, our latest blog is a review of the book that Dr. Gillian had wrote on Arab embroidery. So if you go connect to it, you will be able to see the review and be able to understand more about the book. Now, part of our mission to empower students is providing access to webinars, which are complimentary. One just needs to register to our newsletter to keep up to date with our programs. However, if one likes to access the whole library of recordings, you will need to become a friend of the Zay Initiative. On the other hand, if you are looking for a light way to explore the topic in brief daily doses, you can follow us on our Instagram or Facebook pages, where you will find real-time heated dialogues, as Wafa mentioned, from our followers as they debate terms and origins of certain articles while providing us with a wealth of raw information that we need to sift through and study. Empowerment comes through knowledge. Once we open a window to other cultures, we get ourselves familiar with their basic nuances. We put aside any misconceptions as we understand their original meaning and give credit to their sources to help stop reinforcing stereotypes and identifying with our shared humanity. On a final note, just in case you think the topic is too far away to touch your circle, as Dr. Gillian mentioned a few minutes ago, here is yet another reminder that Arab dress influences are much closer to you than you might think. This is an Egyptian turbitelli dress worn by Barbra Streisand at the Grammy Awards in 1977. Now, I thank you for your patience, and I hope I managed to give you a very brief and very fast introduction to the Arab world and its dress culture, enough to whet your appetite to want to learn more and join us in sustaining this legacy. These are a few of our upcoming events. Please scan the QR code and connect with us. Thank you very much for affording me this opportunity, ladies. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reem. That was fascinating and beautiful.
Thank you.
I think that's what I'm struck by from all of the presentations this morning is how beautiful the textiles are. I don't know about the rest of you, but this might be a good time to start thinking if you have any questions. If you have one, you can type it into the chat and I'll be glad to pose it to either one or all of our panelists. But before we get started on your questions, I have one. As I looked at Wafa's images, especially from when you were a little girl and beginning to learn embroidery, I was struck by the piece that looked like it had flowers, possibly even pre-printed on it and embroidered, but then you were going back over and doing black in the background. Is that correct? Do you remember that image?
Are you referring to this image?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. So is that a technique? What technique are you using?
So this is how we create a traditional Palestinian dress. We, at least now in the last 100 years, I'd say we have waste canvas, which is that sort of white gridded fabric there. It's placed on top of the black fabric, which is usually a linen or a cotton or a linen cotton blend, something like that. And it's secured onto that fabric. And then we go in and stitch. Usually we use cross stitch. So cross stitch is our main form. These are different pieces of the thobe. It's the chest panel is what my mom's carrying on her chest, and the skirt panels, and this is before it was completed. I might, if I have some time, find the completed garden dress, but that's me when I was helping remove waste canvas. So my mother, the way the operation would go is my mother would stitch and we would remove waste canvas until we graduated to stitching and removing our own waste canvas. So
very good.
It was a process of learning and passing in my family.
So is the waste canvas, is that strips of fabric?
It's like what you can see here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, but you see that it's like a grid. There are threads put together into a grid, and it's to guide your stitches, and it's intended to be removed. That's why it's waste canvas. But it's placed on the fabric that once you remove the waste canvas, we use tweezers. Some people use their fingers, but I don't have that kind of strength in my fingers. So we would use tweezers. Then it reveals the embroidery on the fabric itself.
Oh, all right. Very good.
So here's a halfway chest where it's like half of the waste canvas is removed and half is not. Do you see?
Right. Now I understand. For some reason, I had thought that you were the waste canvas was the real canvas, not the waste. That's very interesting. I haven't ever seen that before. Someone asked, what is the count of the waste canvas? Do you happen to know?
In this one, it was 14 count waste canvas, but when you look at older dresses, when they didn't have computers and things like that, their stitches were a lot smaller, maybe 16 count, 18 count, I don't know, but waste canvas didn't come in to our practice until the early 20th century, maybe early to mid 20th century. So they didn't use waste canvas always. But yeah, and in this dress, it was 14 count.
Oh, very good. All right, we have a question. Let's see. What is the best way to approach, which is to learn or wear, Tatreez in a way that is not cultural appropriation and that communicates respect for the art and culture?
Dr.
So I'm
Gillian,
assuming this would be, someone of European descent or North American or South American. Well, how would you feel about someone else wearing those garments?
This is one of these misconceptions, because for thousands of years, ideas, textiles have been traveling from one part of the world to the other, going north, south, southeast, west, east, everywhere. And you will find in Japan Western style garments. Is that cultural appropriation with your definition? Because you're just mentioning Western. But all cultures have been involved in this. And what is important is it's adopt. You see something you like, you adopt it, you adapt it to your own needs. And then the third A, which is coming in and needs to be really pushed, acknowledgement. And then diversity, inspiration, development takes place. If you keep to this concept, you're only allowed to wear this or this pattern if you are from that particular culture, then it stagnates. And it is something that is only in the last 20, 30, 40 years, people have said, just hang on a minute. And in some cases, quite rightly, because acknowledgement hasn't taken place. You have to say where these things come from, but then continue.
Very good. And I suppose the other part of it is commercialization of different textiles, being reproduced without attribution is the big problem, rather than me wearing something beautiful that I purchased on a trip to another country.
Exactly.
I think,
just celebrate it.
Sorry about that.
Sure, go ahead, Wafa.
Yeah, I think I completely agree that this idea of dressing your own ethnicity is actually is actually ludicrous. It actually is a form of kind of this prejudice and division. But I do want to say that there is also a difference between individual and industry. And if you're purchasing designs that are belonging to another cultural heritage from a maker that is like a company or a corporation, and they are not acknowledging its origination and have divorced it from its cultural context, you will be contributing to appropriation. Part of our boycott, part of fighting appropriation is it is in part of not contributing to industry that divorces our items, our cultural heritage items, from their original context and does not acknowledge, as Dr. Gillian was saying. But as an individual, I think, and I see this in my classes a lot, if somebody is aware, if they are educating, because to me, fighting appropriation is just in the simple act of educating. And so if somebody has education and they are able to articulate the origination of the garment or the design that they've created, then that, of course, is not appropriation. That is true appreciation. That, I think, is the truest form of appreciation.
Okay, very good. 2 more questions, and then we'll probably have to wrap things up. One is, someone has noticed there are pieces of original Tatreez dresses for sale on some websites. Is that an effort to promote the history or something else? Do you know about that?
I think I know what Susie's talking about here. Yeah, on some Etsy sites, like on an Etsy, that like Etsy.com, where there's all these different sellers, and sometimes these vintage shops, at least in the United States and in some other areas in the world, you'll find thobes that were acquired, like historic dresses, cut up into pieces and sold in different pieces, and the origination of the textile is not indicated. The person themselves, that's not belonging to their cultural heritage, and it's just an effort to make money. And I think, Susie, that's what you're referring to. Is that, I don't know if that's what you're referring to, but I see this a lot, and I get a lot of questions about it in my classes, like, should I buy and rescue those scraps? But what it ends up doing is contributing to the business of that person who continues to acquire historic dresses and cut them up for sale. And it isn't an effort to promote or preserve our history.
All right, that sounds a little nasty to me, but everyone doesn't have the same set of values that we do. I have a question, Dr. Gillian.
Yes.
2 embroidery encyclopedias to your credit, when someone wonders what geographic area you're going to cover next.
I heard 2 days ago that volume 3, Sub-Saharan South Africa is now in the next stage of publication. So it's in press and should be out by the end of the year. I'm currently working on Scandinavia and West Europe, but the publishers don't know this yet. It's actually 2 volumes. I don't tell them. Please don't tell them, anybody. And then we'll be working, because of these 2 large donations, which are mostly Central and Eastern European, volume 5, which is that area of Europe, plus Russia, plus Georgia, plus etc. And a friend of mine wants to take over the Asian volume, and I'm seriously thinking yes, because Bloomsbury want me to write 8 volumes in total. Yeah, I have to get up early.
That's a fabulous challenge, isn't it?
It's wonderful, and I've learned so much. And a lot of my own preconceptions have gone out the window. And I do a lecture called What is Embroidery? And end up with the question, do you actually need stitches present for it to be a piece of embroidery? And I'm not going to explain how I get that piece of that question out. That you'll have to have the lecture.
Very good. All right.
But
well, I'm going to draw us to a close at this point. I know that we could all go on for a long time, but the brilliant textiles that you've shared with us today will be available for viewing on all of these websites. Kelsey is going to send out a follow-up email with a link to the YouTube video of this presentation, and also with information about how to contact each of our speakers and their websites, so that you can explore those at your leisure or in the middle of the night when you can't sleep, because it looks like with 30,000 textiles digitized, plus we could do this for a long time. So I thank you for all 3 of our speakers today for your wonderful presentations and for your heroic efforts to preserve and share these textiles. It's been eye-opening to me, and I'm sure to many of the rest of our attendees today. I'll make one more mention that 2 weeks from today, we will be doing a special program on textiles of Ukraine. And if you haven't signed up for that yet, Kelsey will be sending out information soon for how to do that.
Yes.
So thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers. Hooray. And we'll see you next time.
Until next time.